so let's hear about fairy tales and adventures.
Audiosnow.com presents Fairy Tales and Adventures, an adaptation of the Finnish fairy tale of The Mighty Mikko, read by Ariel Hicks and written by Josh Virila. Happy listening. In a time quite some ages ago, there was once an old woodsman and his wife. Don't get too attached. They had but only one handsome son named Mikko, a rugged yet boyishly charming Chris Pratt type of young man. Unfortunately, we enter this story as Mikko bitterly weeps for his mother, who lay dying in their more than modest two-room cottage in the deep forest. "When you are gone, my dear mother, there will be no one left to think of me," Mikko said. His poor mother comforted him as best she could. "You will still have your father," she said, in no way foreshadowing. Shortly after the woman's death, Mikko's father, too, was taken ill, probably from the heartbreak of losing your spouse of 30-plus years. "Now, indeed, I shall be left desolate and alone," Mikko thought as he sat beside his father's bedside and saw him grow weaker and weaker. Wow! He sure has a way of turning things to make him the focus.
"My boy,"
the old man said just before he died,
"I have nothing to leave you but the 3 snares I've used for many years. They are good snares, and I have caught many wild animals. Those snares now belong to you. When I am dead, go into the woods, and if you find a wild creature caught in any of them, free it gently and bring it home alive."
Okay, Mikko thought. Kind of the opposite of how snares work. I mean, the whole purpose is to catch things so I can have some dinner. But you know what? Okay, I guess I can honor my dying father's last wish. So, after his father's death, Mikko remembered the snares and went out to the woods to see them. The first was empty. So too was the second. Aha! But in the third, he found a little red fox. He carefully lifted the spring that had shut down on one of the fox's feet, and then carried the little creature home in his arms. He shared his supper with the fox, which I assume was just a bowl of water since he hadn't caught anything and doesn't seem our boy Mikko has any farming skills. Anyway, he went to sleep and the fox curled up at his feet. They lived together some time until they became close friends, as one does with a wild animal that's been brought home. "Mikko," said the fox one day, "why are you so sad?" "Because I'm lonely," said Mikko. Wait, what? Because he's lonely? That's the first thing he says to the fox? Not, "Holy sleeping beauty, a talking fox!" Okay, we'll go with it. So, then the fox says, "That's no way for a young man to talk. You ought to get married. Then you wouldn't feel lonely." "Married?" Mikko replied. "How can I get married? I can't marry a poor girl because I'm too poor myself. And a rich girl wouldn't marry me." "Nonsense," said the fox. "You're a fine, well-set-up young man, and you're kind and gentle. I mean, you fixed my foot after all. What more could a princess ask?" Mikko laughed to think of a princess wanting him for a husband. "Ha ha ha! I mean what I say," the fox insisted with a nudge. "Take our own nameless princess of our land. She's pretty cute. What would you think of marrying her?" Mikko laughed louder than before. "Ha ha ha ha! I have heard that she is the most beautiful princess in the world. And by world, I mean this town and the adjacent town. We aren't really an upwardly mobile society in these times, you know. Anyway, any man would be happy to marry her," Mikko said. "Very well," the fox said. "If you feel that way about her, then I'll arrange the wedding for you." With that, the little fox trotted off to the royal castle to gain audience with the king. He just walked right up there and entered the castle like, no big deal. "My master sends you greetings," the fox said, "and he begs you to loan him your bushel measure." Oh, a bushel, by the way, is a unit of measure. In non-fairy tale land, it's equal to 8 gallons of dried product. Basically, it's like a hamper you carry produce in.
My bushel measure?
The king repeated in surprise.
Who is your master and why does he want my bushel measure?
Really? Not sweet Snow White eyelids, a talking fox! I guess this isn't unusual in this kingdom. Moving on. Shh, the fox whispered, as though he didn't want the courtiers to hear what he was saying. Then, sneaking up quite close to the king, he murmured in his ear. "Surely, you have heard of Mikko, haven't you? Mighty Mikko, as he's called." The king had never heard of any Mikko who was known as Mighty Mikko. He had heard of Meek Mikko and Measly Mikko, but not
Mighty Mikko.
Thinking that perhaps he should have heard of him, he shook his head and murmured,
Mikko, Mighty Mikko. Oh, to be sure. Yes, of course.
"Fake it till you make it, king." The fox continued, "My master is about to start off on a journey, and he needs a bushel measure for a very particular reason."
I understand,
the king said, although he didn't understand at all, and he gave orders that the bushel measure, which they used in the storeroom of the castle, be brought in and given to the fox after he had signed out for it, of course. The fox carried off the bushel measure, which apparently was the only one in the whole kingdom, and hid it in the woods. Then he scurried about to all sorts of little out-of-the-way nooks and crannies where people had hidden their savings, and he dug up a gold piece here and a silver piece there until he had a handful. Then he went back to the woods and stuck the various coins in the cracks of the measure. You know, I don't recommend using the dirt savings and loan method of banking. Burying your savings, especially when you're poor, is a good way to have a fox or any enchanted creature dig them up. Okay, so the next day, the fox returned to the king. "My master, Mighty Mikko," he said, "sends you thanks, O king, for the use of your bushel measure." The king held out his hand, and when the fox gave him the measure, he peeped inside to see if by chance it contained any trace of what had recently been measured. His eye, of course, at once caught the glint of gold and silver coins lodged in the cracks. "Ah," he said, thinking Mikko must be a very mighty lord indeed to be so careless of his wealth, although one who oddly doesn't have his own bushel measure. "I should like to meet your master. Won't you and he come and visit me?" This, of course, is what the fox wanted the king to say, but he pretended to hesitate. "Hi, thank your majesty for the kind invitation," he said, "but I fear my master can't accept it just now. He wants to get married soon, and we are about to start off on a long journey to inspect a number of foreign princesses. We just bought a shirt that says Foreign Princess Inspector, so it's pretty legit." This made the king all the more anxious to have Mikko visit him at once, for he thought that if Mikko should see his lovely nameless daughter before he saw those foreign princesses, he might fall in love with her and marry her. So he said to the fox, "My dear fox, you must convince your master to make a visit before he starts out on his travels. You will, won't you?" The fox looked this way and that, as if he were too embarrassed to speak. "Your Majesty," he said at last, "please pardon my frankness, but the truth is you are not rich enough to entertain my master, and your castle isn't big enough to house the immense entourage that always rolls with him." The king, who by this time was frantic to see Mikko, lost his mind completely. "My dear fox," he said, "I'll give you anything in the world if you can convince your master to visit me at once.
Couldn't you suggest to him to travel with a modest group of advisors and assistants this time? The fox shook his head. No, his rule is either travel with all his people, or to go on foot, disguised as a poor woodsman, attended only by me.
Okay, yeah, how about that then? I don't mind if he shows up as a poor woodsman.
Could you ask him to come like that? The king begged. Once he is here, I could place gorgeous fancy clothes at his disposal. But still the fox shook his head. I fear your majesty's wardrobe doesn't contain the kind of clothes my master is accustomed to. I assure you I've got some very good clothes. Not one of them from an outlet, the king said. Come along this minute and we'll go through them, and I'm sure you will find some that your master would wear. So they went to a room, which was really a walk-in closet, but the size of a normal peasant's house, and with hundreds and hundreds of hooks upon which were hung hundreds of coats and breeches and embroidered shirts. The king ordered his attendants to bring the costumes down one by one and place them before the fox. They began with the plainer clothes. Good enough for most people, said the fox, but not for my master. Then they took down garments of a finer grade. I'm afraid you're going to all this trouble for nothing, the fox said. Frankly, my master couldn't possibly put on any of these things. Come on, where's the good stuff? The king, who had hoped to keep his own use of his most gorgeous clothes of all, now ordered these to be shown. The fox looked at them sideways, sniffed them critically, and at last said, Well, perhaps my master would consent to wear these for a few days. They are not what he is accustomed to wear, but I will say this for him. He is not proud. The king was overjoyed, as he clearly didn't realize when he was being insulted. Very well, my dear fox. I'll have the guest chambers prepared for your master's visit, and I'll have all these, my finest clothes, laid out for him. You'll be able to convince your master, won't you? I'll do my best, the fox promised. With that, he bade the king a civil good day and ran home to Mikko. The next day, as the nameless princess was peeping out of an upper window of the castle, as one does when you have no real entertainment except the sky, she saw a young woodsman approaching, accompanied by a fox. He was a fine, wholesome-looking youth, and the princess, who knew from the presence of the fox that he must be Mikko, gave a long sigh and confided to her serving maid. I think I could fall in love with that young man if he were really only a woodsman. A woodsman, you say, princess? Should we tell her yet? Nah. Later, when she saw him dressed in her father's finest clothes, which looked better on Mikko than they did the king, because, check out that bod. Well, like they say, every woman loves the sharp-dressed man. Princess No-Name lost her heart completely, and when Mikko was presented to her, she blushed and trembled just as any ordinary girl might before a handsome young man. All the court was equally delighted with Mikko. The ladies went into ecstasies over his modest manners, his fine figure, and the gorgeousness of his clothes. Manners are hot. Also, the old graybeard counselors nodded their heads in approval to each other and said, This guy, he's no conceited dandy, that's for sure. In spite of his great wealth, see how politely he listens to us when we talk. The next day, the fox went privately to the king and said, My master is a man of few words and quick judgment. He bids me to tell you that your daughter, you know, the princess, pleases him mightily, and that, with your approval, he will get to courting her at once. The king was greatly agitated and began, My dear fox! But the fox interrupted him to say, Hey, be cool. think the matter over carefully and give me your decision tomorrow. No need to be hasty."
So the king consulted with the princess and his counselors, and in a short time, the marriage was arranged and the wedding ceremony actually performed. It's easy when your castle can also double as a wedding venue. It's good being rich, am I right? Even on short notice, they make it happen. Do you know how hard it is for a commoner to get a venue? I mean, they gotta wait like 7 months just to reserve the mill. But I digress. So, the fox said to Mikko when they were alone after the wedding, "Didn't I tell you? Didn't I?" "Yes, you're the man, fox," Mikko acknowledged. "You did promise that I should marry the princess. But tell me, now that I'm married, what am I to do? I can't live here forever with my wife in her castle."
"Put your mind at rest," the fox said. "I've thought of everything. Just do as I tell you, and you'll have nothing to regret. Tonight, go to the king and say this: 'It is now only fitting that you should visit me and see for yourself the sort of castle over which your daughter will be mistress.'" When Mikko said this to the king was overjoyed, for now that the marriage had actually taken place, he was wondering whether he hadn't perhaps been a little hasty. I mean, usually kings wait a week for a stranger to marry their daughters, but this king was always known as a leap first, look second type of leader. At any rate, Mikko's words reassured him, and he eagerly accepted the invitation to visit Mikko's castle. On the morrow, the fox said to Mikko, "Excuse me while I run up ahead and get things ready for you." "But where are you going?" Mikko said, frightened at the thought of being deserted by his little friend. The fox drew Mikko aside and whispered softly, "No worries, fam, I got you. A few days' march from here, there is a very gorgeous castle belonging to a wicked old dragon who is known as the Worm. I think the Worm's castle would just about suit you, if you know what I mean." Wink. "I'm sure it would," Mikko agreed. "But how are we to get it away from the Worm?" "Trust me," the fox said. "All you need to do is this. Lead the king and his courtiers along the main highway, and around noon tomorrow, you should reach a crossroads. Turn there to the left and go straight on until you see the tower of the Worm's castle. If you meet any men by the wayside, shepherds, servants, or the like, ask them whose men they are, and show no surprise at their answer. So now, dear master, farewell until we meet again at your beautiful castle." Wink. The little fox trotted off swiftly while Mikko, the princess, and the king, attended by the whole court, followed in more leisurely fashion. The little fox, upon leaving the highway at the crossroads, soon met 10 woodsmen standing around discussing who had chopped the best chop today. They were all dressed in blue smocks, clearly either a uniform or they were a competitive wood chopping team. "Good day," the fox said politely. "Whose men are you?" "Our master is known as the Worm," the woodman told him. "My poor, poor lads," the fox said, shaking his head sadly. "What's the matter?" the woodsman asked. For a few moments, the fox pretended to be too overcome with emotion to speak. Then he said, "Gentlemen, don't you know that the king is coming with a great force to destroy the Worm and all his people? Like, serious shock and awe level stuff." The woodsmen, to be honest, were not the sharpest blades in the shed, and this news gave them quite a bout of anxiety. "Is there any way for us to escape?" they asked. The fox put his paw to his head and thought. "Well," he said at last, "there is one way you might escape, and that is by telling everyone who asks that you are the men of Mighty Mikko. But if you value your lives never again, say that your master is the Worm."
We are Mighty Mikko's men. The woodsman at once began repeating over and over. We are Mighty Mikko's men. We are Mighty Mikko's men. We are Mighty Mikko's men. The fox grinned slyly as he made his way down the road. Here, he met 20 stablemen, dressed in the same blue smocks, who were tending 100 beautiful horses. The fox talked to the 20 stablemen, as he had talked to the woodsman. Again, these chaps were a few straws short of a haystack, as they say. Before the fox left them, he had them also shouting,
We are Mighty Mikko's men! We are Mighty Mikko's men! We are Mighty Mikko's men!
Next, the fox came to a huge flock of 1,000 sheep, tended by 30 shepherds, all dressed in the worm signature couture blue smocks. He stopped and talked to them until he had these simple folk roaring out,
We are Mighty Mikko's men! We are Mighty Mikko's men! We are Mighty Mikko's men!
Then, the fox trotted on until he reached the castle of the worm. He found the worm himself inside, slothing about. He was a huge dragon, and had been a great warrior back in the day. In fact, his castle, lands, servants, and his possessions had all been won in battle. A real rags to riches story, let me tell you. But that's a story for another time. Anyway, this self-made dragon was so fierce in the day that for many years no one cared to fight him, and he had grown fat and lazy. "Good day!" the fox said, pretending to be very breathless and frightened. "You're the worm, aren't you?"
Yes, I'm the great worm,
the dragon said boastfully. "Although now that I think about it, worm seems like a bit of a downgrade of a title." The fox pretended to grow more agitated. "My poor friend, I'm sorry for you, but of course none of us can expect to live forever. Well, excuse me, I must hurry along. I thought I would just stop and say goodbye." Made uneasy by the fox's words, the worm cried out. "Oh, wait just a minute. What's the matter?" the worm said. The fox was already at the door, but at the worm's plea, he paused and said over his shoulder, "Why, my dear fellow, you surely know, don't you, that the king and all the king's men are coming to destroy you and all your people." "What?" the worm gasped, turning a sickly green with fright. He knew he was fat and helpless and could never again fight as in the years gone by. "Wait, don't go just yet," he begged the fox. "When is the king coming?" "He's on the highway now. That's why I must be going. Goodbye," said the fox. My good fox, just stay a moment and I'll reward you richly. Help me to hide so that the king won't find me. What about the shed where the linen is stored? I could crawl under the linen, and then if you lock the door from the outside, the king could never find me." "Very well," the fox agreed. "But we must hurry." So, they ran outside to the shed where the linen was kept, and the worm hid under a pile of, I'm guessing, California king-sized bed linens. The fox locked the door, then set fire to the shed, and soon there was nothing left of that wicked old dragon, the worm, but a handful of ashes. I mean, I guess he was wicked. I didn't really see any indication of such. It seemed like he employed people and they weren't mistreated. Plus, does anyone know how long it takes a dragon body to burn into ash? It seems like a several-day type of thing. Oh well. So, the fox now called together the dragon's household and talked to them about Mikko, as he had the woodsman, the stablemen, and the shepherds. Meanwhile, the king and his party were slowly covering the ground just now, getting to where the fox had been much earlier. When they came to the 10 woodsmen in blue smocks, the king said,
I wonder whose woodsmen those are.
One of the attendants asked the woodsman, and the 10 of them shouted at the top of their voices,
We are Mighty Mikko's men!
Mikko said nothing, and the king and all the court were impressed anew with his modesty. A little further on, they met the 20 stablemen and their 100 prancing horses. When the stablemen were questioned, just as the woodsmen were, they answered with a shout,
"We are Mighty Mikko's men!"
"The fox certainly spoke the truth when he told me of Mikko's riches," the king thought to himself. A little later, the 30 shepherds were questioned. And guess how they answered? That's right, in a chorus that was deafening to hear. Say it with me!
"We are Mighty Mikko's men!"
The sight of the 1,000 sheep that belonged to his son-in-law made the king feel poor and humble in comparison, and the courtiers whispered among themselves,
"For all his simple manner, Mighty Mikko must be a richer, more powerful lord than the king himself, even though he didn't have his own bushel measure. In fact, it is only a very great lord indeed who could be so simple."
At last they reached the castle, and the blue-smocked soldiers that guarded the gateway was a clue that this was Mikko's place. The fox came out to welcome the king's party, and behind him, in 2 rows, all the household servants. These, at the signal from the fox, cried out in one voice,
"We are Mighty Mikko's men!"
Then Mikko, in the same simple manner that he would have used in his father's little hut in the woods, bade the king and his followers welcome, and they all entered the castle, where they found a great feast already prepared and waiting. The king stayed on for several days, and the more he saw of Mikko, the better pleased he was that he had him for a son-in-law. When he was leaving, he said to Mikko,
"Man, I love your place. I really mean it. Your castle is so much better than mine that I hesitate to ever ask you back for a visit."
But Mikko reassured the king by saying earnestly, "My dear father-in-law, the first time I entered your castle, I thought it was the most beautiful castle in the world." Smooth move, Mikko, my boy. So, the king was obviously flattered, and the courtiers whispered among themselves again,
"How courteous of him to say that, when he knows very well how much grander his own castle is than the king's."
When the king and his followers were safely gone, the little red fox came to Mikko and said, "Now, my master, you have no reason to feel sad and lonely. You are lord of the most beautiful castle in the world. Well, this relative region anyways, and you have the hottest, sweetest, nameless, and loveliest princess for a wife. I don't think you need me anymore. So, I'm going to bid you farewell." Mikko thanked the little fox for all he had done, and the little fox trotted off to the woods, because I guess the fox got tired of carrying Mikko through life. So Mikko's poor old father, remember him from the beginning? Well, although he had no wealth to leave his son, he was really the cause of all of Mikko's good fortune, for it was he who told Mikko in the first place to carry home alive anything he might find caught in the snares. Thanks for sitting on the secret of the magical fox who could bring us out of poverty and swindle us into nobility, Dad. The end. Until next time, this has been AudioSnow.com presents Fairy Tales and Adventures, an adaptation of the Finnish Fairy Tale of The Mighty Mikko, read by Ariel Hicks and written by Josh Virla. Fairy Tales and Adventures opening theme performed by Alexis Yanis. Additional music of Medieval Introduction by Tristan Lohengren. Copyright AudioSnow.com. Thanks for listening.